to take us through the scriptures, Lord God, and help us to learn from our sister Esther and how this is a word for us today, Lord, for such a time as this, Lord God. So we just pray, speak through him by the work of your Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Great. Good morning.
Good morning.
That's my new name, Officer Johnny. Ever since Hayley came to live with us for a week or two, it transformed our lives. Very good. So we've been looking at portraits of faith and characters in the Bible that can illustrate what does faith mean and what their journey in life has been. And I must say I struggled with Esther, and I'll tell you about that soon, because I'm not sure if she had faith. But we'll explore that very soon. Very good. When I was quite young, 9 or 10 years old, somehow, probably through a neighbour, I got into chess. And I really enjoyed chess and the strategies. I didn't know a lot about strategies, but I really enjoyed the fact that I had been taught how to win a game of chess in 3 moves. You know, it's called the Scholar's Mate, and I just thought it was marvellous. I entered a championship at school, and I was playing chess, and as I was doing my 3 moves, and I was winning, and I was starting to go up the ladder and starting to get advanced, you know, into the championship, and I could just see the prize in front of me, and I was really excited because of these 3 moves. Until I faced an opponent who was a little younger than me. He might have been a year younger than me, but he knew about the 3 moves. And he knew how to defend himself on those 3 moves. So we started. Move number 1. I thought, this is good. It's going to be the same as before. Move number 2. Yeah, we're going, ooh, that was a bit different, but we should be okay. And move number 3, right. And then he moves a certain way, and he totally disarmed me. In fact, he went to win the game, and I think he might have even won the championship. He just knew more than what I did. You know, sometimes that happens in life. We've got our plans. We've got our 3 moves. We've got our life mapped up. We think everything, well, I'm going to do this. This is my purpose. This is my goal. This is what I'm going to do. And this is how I'm going to play it out, and then something happens and everything turns to custom. When we read the Bible, we find many stories like that. We find stories that there's an obvious plot, and then there's an invisible plot that is being played out in the spiritual realm. We see that God can work through circumstances to defeat the most evil schemes that the devil brings into this human race. God is the master strategist, and he ensures, according to his word, that all things work together for good for those who love him. Do you believe that? We've been hearing in the sharing time about this kind of thing. You know, do we know that we can trust God, that we can have a heavenly perspective rather than an earthly perspective, and we can see things from heaven's point of view but still live on earth? That's called living by faith. Seeing things differently. Not just the things that are right in front of me, but seeing things from God's perspective and trusting him to work it out for us. And one of these stories is the life of Esther. It is a story which is part of God's bigger story. It's a little bit, I don't know if you come across Russian dolls, you know, open one and there's another one, and then you open that and there's another one, and it just goes on and on. Well, this story is a little bit like that. The story of Esther is found in pretty much the middle of the Bible, and it is part of God's bigger story. But also within the story of Esther, we have a main plot, and we have 3 different little stories that weave themselves together in order to bring everything to one purpose and one goal. And we're going to look a little bit about the story of Esther. So first of all, let's look at how does it fit in history. Who likes history? Yeah, oh, about 10%. So we'll give it a go. So the country of Israel, it had been called out and formed a long time ago as it came out of another country called Egypt. And this country was dedicated to God. And as they served God, things were going well. But for a long time, they turned away from God. In fact, 490 years they turned away from God. And God disciplined them. Because God cares about his people, but he also cares about what is right. And what happened was that God brought the Assyrian Empire and conquered 10 tribes of Israel and took them away in the 700s before Christ. And then after that, the Babylonians came along and took the remaining 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin and took them away into the empire of Babylon. For 70 years they were held captive, and the prophet Jeremiah had prophesied that it would be 70 years, and one of the prophets prophesied and named by name this king called Cyrus 70 years before this king became king, and said he's going to be the one who's going to decree that you are going to come back to your land. See, that one of the reasons I believe in God is because one of the evidences that God is God is that he knows the future. You know, and in the Bible we have many predictions. In fact, 1/3 of the Bible is prophecy. And in that we can see God saying this is what's going to happen, and then many of those things have happened in the biblical time, and we see the fulfillment. Some are still to happen. So in 538 before Christ, we've got the decree of Cyrus for the people to go back. The people of Israel to go back to their land. And what you've got up there on the screen is there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different books in the Bible that interweave themselves into each other. So the first one is the book of Ezra. And in the book of Ezra we see the decree of Cyrus, we see the people of Israel going back to Jerusalem, we see the temple starting to be built, and then the work of the temple building stops. 15 years after it stopped, we see the book of Haggai and the book of Zechariah, which are found in the Old Testament. Some funny names in the Old Testament. These are prophets that went to the people of Israel and said, you built your houses, why don't you build the temple? What's going on? Where's your priorities, as we heard before? And then a decree comes through in the very same year that these prophets speak from Darius, and the temple is completed. And it's in 486 and 479, still in the middle of the book of Ezra, that the book of Esther plays out. There's 4 big empires in the world at this time. The Babylonians first, the Medes and the Persians next, they took over. The Greeks came, you would have heard of Alexander the Great in the 300s before Christ. And then following the Greeks was the Roman Empire. And so these big 4 empires were the big movers in those days. This is the backdrop of the story of Esther. The story of Esther starts in the second of those empires, the Persian Empire. And Esther was an orphan. She had lost her father, lost her mother. She was a refugee, but had been in the country. She was possibly born in Persia, and because they had been in captivity, they had not gone back when Cyrus had decreed that they could go back. And so Esther lived with her older cousin Mordecai, and they lived together, and he raised her, and now Esther is a young lady, a beautiful young lady, in a foreign land. At that time, a king called Xerxes comes to the throne. And Xerxes was a bit of a party king. 3 years into his reign, he sets up a party. What's the longest party you've been? 1 day? A week? 180 days. 6 months. And the party, how big was the biggest party you've been to? I went to a wedding and there were about 400 there. But I've been to other events where there's been 6,000. This was the whole empire. 127 provinces that extended from Ethiopia in Africa to India in Asia. The whole empire was in party mode for 6 months. And at the end of that party, in the city of Susa, which was the capital of Persia, the king sets up a week's final party, just in case you missed the 6 months. Yeah? And right at the end, you imagine after drinking that much how they were. He says, call the queen. Call Vashti, my queen, to come. And the queen comes. No, she doesn't. He thought she would come. But she said, no. I'm not going to be paraded in front of a whole heap of drunks. No one had ever said no to that king before. No one had ever stood up to him. And as a result of that, the king says, what do I do? He asks his advisors, and the advisor says, you better sort it out, because otherwise all our wives are going to do the same thing to us. They were scared. And sadly what he did, he exiled Vashti, and he started something that was pretty grotesque, a bit of a beauty pageant to select the new queen. And I won't go into all the details of it, because pretty much the king had 2 harems, yeah, and 2 groups of women, and pretty much they were one-night stands to select the queen. It was terrible the way they treated women in those days. In selecting the queen, Esther forms part of that cohort. She's selected and she goes to the palace. And in the palace, she's put through, you know how you go to beauty course? Yeah? They had 12 months of baths and perfume and cosmetics and all sorts. So things were pretty full on in those days. You sort of came out like, well, like panel beating, you know. So, but and this was this is what happened before the girls, the women were presented to the king. She won the contest and she became the new queen. But one thing she kept secret was that she was a Jew. No one knew except for Mordecai and her son. And this is where the story takes different plots. You know, sometimes, you know those series of movies like Marvel or Star Wars or so on, you know, you sort of have some really good movies and then they start tacking things on, and this is the prologue and the epilogue and the something log, and it's all a big log, and you know, and it doesn't quite fit, but this is one of those where it all fits together because God is behind this story. And so that the main story, Esther becomes queen. Let's pause a little bit. Little story number 1, just in the middle of that. Mordecai, her cousin, starts to get close to the palace and keeps an eye on Esther from a distance to see how things are going. And he is part of the people that welcomes people into the palace. And he hears one day that there's a plot to assassinate the king. And he sends the message to Queen Esther and says, you better warn the king that there's a plot against him. And sure enough, the king is warned, and they catch the people, and the murder is averted, so that it didn't happen. This is recorded. In those days, they recorded things in chronicles, yeah, and they record this in a book. That's the end of story number 1. But just remember that, because that's going to have an effect later on in the big story. Story continues. A man called Haman gets appointed as prime minister, and he's the one who is the big leader. He's number 2 after the king, And he was an Agagite, which came from a race called the Amorites, which God had commanded King Saul to, and this is the things that happened in those days in the Old Testament, to, when they caught them, to eliminate them. But they didn't. And so an Amorite emerges with hatred towards the Jews. One day, Haman enters into the palace, and he sees everybody bows down before Haman out of respect, except for Mordecai. He stands still. Because, although the Bible doesn't tell us this, but we know that the Jews only bow down to God, the one true God. And so as they come into the into the palace, Haman's getting really annoyed. Everybody respects him, but not that Mordecai. And so one day he puts a plot together, and he goes to the king with a suggestion. He says, I will put a lot of money into your bank account, or into the treasury of those days, if you will sign this decree to eliminate all the Jews. Just because of Mordecai, he wanted the whole race to be eliminated. And King says, yeah, okay. That's how they did things in those days. And he signs this. Now, there was something particular about the Persian law. The Persian law was not able to be revoked. So once a king signed an edict, not even the king could undo it. Yeah, once it was signed, it had to happen. So they said, okay, on March the 7th of the following year, this edict went to the whole empire that the entire Jewish people were to be eliminated. Anybody, if your neighbour was a Jew, you were to kill them, and you could take ownership of their property. Terrible genocide was going to occur in this empire. So Haman was pretty happy. But Mordecai and the Jews, there was a huge mourning. People started to cry. People started to get worried all over the empire. And Esther heard that Mordecai was not eating. He had dressed himself in ashes, and he was pretty much looking terrible. So she sends some servants and says, go and find out what's going on. And Mordecai gives the message to the servant, and I want to read these verses. If you have your Bible, feel free to follow, in Esther chapter 4. Because this is we're going to come to this point very soon in the application of the story to us today. But Esther chapter 4 and verse 7. So the servant who was called Hathach had gone to inquire why Mordecai was like this. And verse 7 says, Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king, to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king.
If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So this is the story. The plot is starting to thicken. Mordecai says, Queen, I believe that you are in that position for a day like today. The reason that you became queen is so you can save your people. God had a purpose for Esther. And Esther says, but I can't go just to the king. She couldn't enter the court of the king unless she was invited, even though she was the queen. That's how it worked. And if I enter the court without being invited, I'm going to die unless the king extends his golden scepter, that big thing they used to hold. Yeah, like a stick, a golden one. And she says, and Mordecai says, yeah, you think because you're queen you're going to stay alive? Remember, the edict of the Persians is never revoked, and if you're a Jew and they find out you're a Jew, you'll die too. And you know, God's going to save the Jews, regardless. He didn't mention God, but salvation will come for the Jews. It might come another way. But he says, I believe that you are queen today for this very purpose. Esther got the message, and she said, fast for 3 days and 3 nights. And I'll do the same together with my maids, and then I'll go. And if I die, I die. Wow. What a commitment. So Esther goes to the king. The king sees Esther, a little bit surprised because she hadn't been invited, but he extends the gold scepter to her. And she says, and he says to her, what would you like, Esther? Everything up to half of my kingdom is yours. What a tremendous offer. What would you say? Oh yeah, I'll have India and Persia. No, Esther says, come, I've prepared a banquet for you. You risked your life just to give me a feed. Yeah. But bring Haman with you. So the king and Haman come and they have a good feed. And the king says, but what else do you want, Esther? Everything up to half of the kingdom is yours. And she says, come tomorrow for another banquet. Esther lost it. We'll see why shortly. What would you do? Would you ask for your people straight away? There was a purpose in this plan. She didn't hurry. She didn't hurry. You know, the Bible tells us to be still and know that I am God. To walk at the same pace as God is walking. Little story number 2 starts in the night between those 2 banquets. If Esther had asked for the Jews earlier, it might not have gone right. But listen what happened in that night between the 2 banquets. Haman goes home, and as he leaves the palace, he sees Mordecai again, and he's fed up now. And he puts a plot together, and he builds this big pole 25 meters up into the air. And I'm sorry, it's not a nice thing to say on Sunday morning, but that was to impale Mordecai. He was so angry. You know, evil can do that to someone. It can make you angry to such extent that you'll do stuff that is really terrible. And so he goes back that night to see the king, to ask for permission to kill Mordecai. He couldn't wait till the 7th of March of the next year. He had to get rid of Mordecai. That same night, the king couldn't sleep. That same night, the king couldn't sleep. And so what do you do when you can't sleep? Well, in the case of the king, he gets the Chronicles out. Remember little story number 1? He starts reading, and he reads the story about Mordecai saving him from that death plot a few days, maybe weeks, maybe months before. And he says, has he been rewarded for this? And the servant says, no, he hasn't. The king says, we've got to do something about it. As he is saying that, who's entering the court of the king? Haman. See the two plots coming together. And as Haman comes into the court of the king, the servant said to the king, Haman's outside, bring him in. And he says to Haman, Haman, what would you do to someone who has done so much for you? Haman, thinking that he was talking about him, he said, get your best horse out. Make sure that one of your top servants leads the horse, put the man on the horse, and lead him right through the town, proclaiming that this man has the favour of the king. Great idea, Haman. Can you go and do that to Mordecai? Haman had come and asked him to kill Mordecai, and the king had turned it around, and now Haman was singing the praises of Mordecai against his own wishes. And through that city of Susa, he takes Mordecai on a horse, the one who would have bowed down to him, and now he takes them through the whole city singing his praises. The next day, Haman, who's now angry as, and the king go to Esther's second banquet. Look at this plot. Esther says to the king, I plead for my people because an edict has been made that my people should be destroyed. And the king says, how can that be? Who's done that? And she said, this man Haman. Haman realizing, man, I haven't got long to live now. The king walks out and Haman starts to beg for his life to the queen, and somehow he trips over something and he falls on the same couch that the queen is reclining on as the king comes back in. Another unfortunate set of events for Haman. The king, thinking that Haman's attacking the queen, says, take him out. His servant says, there's a pole out there for Mordecai. Use it on Haman. And then the whole story finishes with Mordecai become prime minister, Esther is still queen, but the king cannot revoke his edict, remember? And so he makes another edict. Mordecai writes it this time. And he sends it to all the provinces, and he says all the Jews can defend themselves on that day. And they should be equipped to defend themselves. And you know, a big feast starts that the Jews celebrate today, the Feast of Purim. Not long ago, a Soviet Jew was asked, what would happen if the Soviets exterminate the Jews? And he says, another feast. Because when Pharaoh tried to exterminate the Jews, we got the Passover.
Yeah.
When Haman tried to exterminate the Jews, we got the Feast of Purim. When the Greek Antiochus Epiphanes tried to exterminate the Jews, we got Hanukkah. What are the lessons that we can learn from here? The first one is this one, purpose and timing. God has a purpose for your life. But sometimes it takes a long time to unfold. My dad was called to go to Uruguay as a missionary when he was 18. He got there when he was 29. And in between that period, God used various assignments here in New Zealand to train him and to help him. And the reason he couldn't get there further from a human point of view was because visas took a long time to process. But God had his time for him. God has a time for you. God has a purpose for you. Might not be the purpose that you think it should be, but he does. And it's much better to what you ever imagined. The other thing that we need to learn from this is that timing is important when dealing with delicate conflicts. Righteous people pick the right moment, they're patient. Be patient when things are not going right. Commit everything to God and He will work it out. Don't be in a hurry when things are not going well. Evil can't wait to satisfy itself. You know, we were talking about before about the sitting in the seat of the unrighteous, and you know, when someone really wants to do something, follow their desires, they can't wait to satisfy them. That was the problem with Haman. He should have stayed home, but he wanted to get rid of Mordecai. Careful planning puts you ahead in the long run, Proverbs 21 verse 5 says, but hurry and scurry puts you further behind. The second thing we can learn is that Esther had sacrificing courage. What does that mean? It means that in life sometimes to do God's will we have to give up our own. If you want to live for God, you've got to learn that it's no longer about you. It's about Him.
Amen.
I don't know if Esther learned that, but she learned that it was no longer about her, but it was about her people. And sometimes God will have a purpose for you, and He will unfold it for you, but sometimes you need to have the courage to take the step that He wants you to take. And so as we live for God, we take a step in obedience to Him, and He does His work. We trust Him for the things we can't do. We obey Him for the things He asks us to do. And that is the story of Esther. God asks us to step out in faith. Moses, he didn't know where he was going. Abraham didn't know he was going, but the Bible tells us he was seeking a city that was invisible. He followed the invisible one. But there was one thing missing in Esther. You know that Esther is the only book in the Bible, at least in the Hebrew Bible, that does not mention God. God is working behind the scenes. It doesn't even mention prayer. Esther said go and fast. She didn't say go and pray. And so I just quickly like to bring the missing piece, the faith in God. And someone asked me to put this into the portraits of faith, and I said, what faith? He said, oh, I'm sure you can find something. And what I found was a comparison between two refugees, Esther and Daniel. Esther had a possible purpose. Who knows if you were made queen for such a time as this? Daniel had a grounded assurance as he entered the presence of King Nebuchadnezzar. He said, I know there is a God in heaven, and I want you to know that too, King. Yeah. Second thing, Esther had a fatalistic courage. She had courage, all right, but she said, if I die, I die. Daniel's three friends, as they faced the furnace, when they wouldn't bow down to the idol of King Nebuchadnezzar, they said this, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and He will deliver us, but even if He does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of God you have set up. I don't know what God's will is, but I know His will is that I should bow to Him and not to anything else. Lastly, Esther had loyalty to her people. Daniel had loyalty to God. Daniel, servant of the living God, Darius, when he put Daniel in the den of lions, he says, was your God whom you serve so faithfully able to rescue from the lions? His replies, yes. Yes, he was. And yes, he did. My friends, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Now, I just want to leave this thought with you. This is what Jesus says about following Him. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up on your own way. You can't follow Jesus your way. You've got to take up your cross daily. Sometimes there's suffering. And follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, he will save it. One man that did this was the Apostle Paul, and this was his mantra in life. My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I just want to leave you with this. God has a purpose for you, and it's the best. It really is. But to follow it, you might have to give up on yourself. And if you do, he will flood you with the joy and peace of knowing him. It's not going to be easy, because we live in a world that doesn't love God and is opposed to him. But if you give your life to God, he will change it. You might not get more money. We don't promise prosperity. But you get eternal blessings. He can change you to live that new life we were talking about earlier. And the lessons from Esther is this. There's a purpose for your life. Sometimes it involves courage and sacrifice, but it's the best. May God bless us with it.